শুভ সন্ধ্যা সবাইকে আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি আজকের আলাপচারিতায়। আজকের আলাপচারিতায় আমরা বিষয় হিসেবে বেছে নিয়েছি ইউকের একটি বিষয়, যে বিষয়টি আমাদেরকে আলোড়িত করেছে বেশ কয়েকদিন ধরেই। সারা এভারেট থেকে শুরু করে সাবিনা নেসা, এই হত্যাকাণ্ডগুলো আবারও জন্ম দিয়েছে নানা প্রশ্নের। সত্যিকার অর্থেই কি বিলেতের বুকে আমরা নিরাপদ বোধ করি, বিশেষ করে নারীরা? পাশাপাশি বিলেতে জনগণের নিরাপত্তায় পুলিশ কতটা সক্রিয়, কতটা আস্থা রাখতে পারি আমরা জনগণ পুলিশের ওপরে? এর আগেও আমরা বিভিন্ন প্রশ্নের সম্মুখীন করতে চেয়েছি পুলিশ বাহিনীকে, কিন্তু তারা কতটা জনগণের প্রশ্নের সম্মুখীন হয়েছেন, কিংবা এথনিক মাইনরিটি কমিউনিটির সঙ্গে পুলিশ বা পুলিশ বাহিনীর কী ধরনের সম্পর্ক রয়েছে, এ ব্যাপারে নানা কথা এসছে, নানা প্রশ্ন এসছে। আজকে আমরা আমাদের স্টুডিওতে আমন্ত্রণ জানাতে পেরেছি পুলিশের একজন সদস্যকে, এবং আমরা অত্যন্ত কৃতজ্ঞ তার কাছে যে তিনি সময় দিয়েছেন আমাদেরকে। আমাদের সঙ্গে আজকে রয়েছেন স্টুডিওতে Shabnam Chaudhri, former Directive Superintendent, Metropolitan Police. Shabnam Chaudhri ke studio te amantron janachhi. Shabnam, welcome to the show, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to actually discuss about this very live and very relevant issue at the time. So how do we there are so many questions. I'm sure our audience would also like to participate, and I would like to welcome our audience, our viewers, to participate and put questions through and comments through about how we actually restore confidence, or any questions you may have to put to Ms. Chaudhri. So দর্শক, আমরা আশা করি আজকে অনুষ্ঠানে আপনারা প্রশ্ন করবেন, আমাদের সঙ্গে সরাসরি সম্পৃক্ত হবেন আলোচনায়। এবং আজকে আমরা যে সুযোগটি পেয়েছি যে পুলিশের এই কর্মকর্তার কাছে আমরা আমাদের প্রশ্ন তুলে ধরবো এবং জানতে চাইবো যে সত্যিকার অর্থে পুলিশ জনগণের জন্য কাজ করছে কিনা। সো Shabnam, I would like to start. Obviously, the very question that's again very live for us is the stabbing, is the death of an MP, Conservative MP in the United Kingdom. So how do we actually especially how do you feel in terms of this death and this stabbing and the security of not only MPs but the public figures?
Yeah, good evening, Urmee, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come onto your programme this evening. The death of Sir David Amess was an absolute tragedy and a horrific shock to all MPs and to all public figures across the whole of the UK. I myself, actually, yesterday I went down to the scene in Leigh-on-Sea. I felt compelled to go and pay my respects to him. I've never met him. It wasn't within my community. I'm from East London, but I felt it was really important to go and to go and pay my respects. A very, very difficult time for MPs in particular, and I think this highlights some real challenges and some huge risks for politicians. It was only 5 years ago that the MP Jo Cox was also murdered outside her constituent, outside her surgery. So, look, I mean, for me, as a former police officer, we had some real difficult challenges. When members of the public, they write to their MPs because they're not happy perhaps about certain things that go on within policing. So it may be that there's antisocial behaviour in their communities, or there's investigations that they're not happy about. And what would happen is we'd have a really good relationship with our local MPs who would write to us, and me as a former senior officer would be responsible for responding back to those letters. So now you've got the situation where the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is talking about bringing in new measures to protect MPs and public figures alike. But it's going to be very difficult. It's not going to be able to be fixed overnight for sure. And to have 24-hour police resourcing put into every single MP is...
There are 360 something plus MPs, so where are you going to get the resources?
Well, that's the question that needs to be answered, and it's not just about the resources. It's got to be a whole range of tactics that need to be taken, measures have to go into place. So, for example, I think, as I understand it today, many MPs have got panic buttons in their surgeries, they've got panic buttons at home. They contact their local police to say that they're going to be hosting surgeries stations in particular locations. Those officers would go and do a risk assessment of the location. They're talking about vetting people as they come through and making sure that there is an appointment system. So there's a whole range of measures that have to be taken, but I think it's unrealistic to expect that every single MP, because not every single MP wants to be protected, and if there's high profile MPs, then that really then exposes those who are not being protected, and all that does is redirect those perpetrators into those areas, into MPs who perhaps haven't got the security measures in place. So they will introduce emergent measures in the next few days, but certainly it will take time to get this resolved as best as they can.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll have to wait and see how it goes, but at the same time, I think at the end of the day, MPs are, they're elected by the people, so it just means that they're going to be detached more and more from the people.
Yeah, but it's important that they have that contact, because that communication is key to actually resolving the issues within communities. And most MPs, as I understand it, and certainly me as a police officer, I joined policing as they do the political side of the arena, to be able to make sure that they have that interaction and they can make a difference in their communities.
Absolutely.
I work very closely with MPs, and that interaction with members of the public is really important.
So let me take you back to what I was saying in my initial comment, Shabnam, is that from Sarah to Sabina, again, the question that has come forward is, how much have you actually changed? What meaningful changes have taken place within the police service from the point when we saw the murder of Stephen Lawrence? Because at that time there was huge, big criticism of police force being institutionalized. There seems to be, institutionalized racism. And have you actually moved forward? What sort of meaningful changes have you done?
Well, I think that I was in the middle of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. I was in the middle of the in 1999 when the Metropolitan Police was labelled institutionally racist. It was a very difficult time for policing, because quite rightly we were given that label, and quite rightly it was understandable why particularly the black community, black and Asian communities had so much mistrust amongst the police. What I would say is this: from 1999 through to even policing now, there were some significant changes made, and I'm not saying that they've made them all. There was a number of recommendations made. There were 78 recommendations made through the Macpherson report, and the 78 of those recommendations, not all of them have still been implemented, which I think is to the detriment of the organisation, because these are the kind of things that help build trust. But let me give you some examples of some changes that were made. So, for example, in those early days, we introduced community safety units so that we could have hate crime units, so that members of the public could come forward and report hate crime more openly. In murder inquiries, they had family liaison officers so that families were given direct support by an individual officer who would then work with those families to help resolve and to bring offenders to justice. The introduction of independent advisory groups, so members of the community who became part of the police were critical friends of the police, not people that came in and sat down and tell you how great you were doing, but people that were openly critical of the way we went about our business so that we could make changes within policing. Move forward many years later, safer neighbourhood teams were introduced, which I think was fantastic. That has now been decimated because of the fact that they've had huge cutbacks in policing, but safer neighbourhood teams were fantastic within local communities because they engaged directly with the hard-to-reach communities, with those underrepresented groups. But also it was a great opportunity for intelligence gathering, faith officers. So there have been a lot of changes. However, what I would say is, the question that keeps being asked is the organisation still institutionally racist? And I think that the Commissioner, Cressida Dick, has been asked that question several times, and rather than say that, look, we should do another review and another inquiry to see how far we've come since 1999, the statement that keeps coming out is it's unhelpful to use that terminology. And it's that kind of narrative that actually erodes trust and confidence further. And I think that we're at a stage now where confidence is at its lowest, particularly since Sabina Nessa and Sarah Everard and Biba Henry, Nicole Smallman, all those murders of women by strangers out in their community. And let's not forget, Sarah Everard was murdered by a police officer who she trusted, who she had a conversation with, who gained her trust and then brutally murdered her.
So you mentioned about hate crime, but do you feel that public feel confident or feel at ease that they are, if they report a hate crime, that will be taken seriously? Because I'm not sure whether you have got the data in terms of how many hate crimes, especially in East London or areas where there is, dominantly Asian community living. How many hate crimes have been reported and how many hate crimes have been actually investigated? Because, people may still want to register the hate crime, but how many have actually been investigated and people have seen that, yes, this is a person who said something really racist to me and I've seen a result as a result of me?
Well, I'll answer that question twofold. There's been a significant increase in hate crime across East London, across London since 2020. Part of that is to do with the pandemic, Brexit, when significant events happened, when you had Black Lives Matter, what happens, that increases hatred towards certain sections of the community. Now, I was explaining to you earlier on that they have community safety, especially trained officers who investigate hate crime. The problems that are faced by police officers, and this is not me making excuses for them because I think a lot more can be done to investigate and to bring offenders to justice, is that many crimes that are reported are generally isolated incidents where that perpetrator has abused verbally somebody in the street as they go past them. And there's two things that happen. Many members of the community don't report it because they accept it as this is the norm, where it's not the norm and it's not acceptable. But many also don't report it because they don't believe that the police will investigate it or that it will be taken seriously. And these are the two fundamental issues that policing does face in respect of being able to bring offenders to justice. So a lot more work does need to be done with local communities. I've worked extensively within the faith communities. When I worked at Scotland Yard, I was a strategic partnership lead, and I set up faith groups across the whole of London, making sure that officers were directly involved with multi-faith communities to encourage people to come and report more crime. Now, in order to investigate and to bring offenders to justice, we need to be able to get people to come and report them, because sometimes some of those crimes will not necessarily get investigated, but it does identify a pattern of behaviour in a certain area. So, for example, if you're in Tower Hamlets and there was significant increase in hate crime but nobody reported it, you wouldn't know about it. But if everybody made an allegation, even though many of those may not get investigated, what it would do is it would ensure that police officers are deployed into particular areas to police those what we call crime hotspots.
So this is for data collection, but actually how would public know that this is, there is also a benefit for data collection? What steps have you actually taken, or the police have taken, to cascade this information to the public or to the community, that even if it doesn't get investigated for the data purpose, you can then ask for more resources, or, as you said, the deployment issue can be looked at? What sort of communication is there between the local community?
Well, as I was explained to you, there's a lot of engagement that goes on with local communities. There will be the neighbourhood officers who will work tirelessly with their local communities. The independent advisory groups, they host meetings every 3 or 4 months, so they're given information on stop and search, on tasers, the use of tasers, the use of handcuffs, how much that has been used. It's those key opinion formers, as those key members of the independent advisory groups, will cascade those messages out to members of the public. Social media is a big way of ensuring that people come forward to report all forms of crime. But we also have to remember, not everybody uses social media. Not everyone uses TikTok, Instagram. I can't keep up with half of it, but many of the social media sites. But it all comes from working with local communities and making sure that police officers are actually embedded within the heart of the community, so that people have that trust to come forward. I don't think it's
I mean, you said stop and search. Obviously, the people who are affected by stop and search are predominantly black and Asian youths, usually, or black and Asian men. And that again puts, for the police, a very challenging position to have trust and faith on the police, because you will see that it's quite embarrassing. You're stopped by the roadside, and just because you're a black person or an Asian person driving a expensive car. So how do you see that from the police perspective?
Well, that's
sorry, Shabnam, we'll have to come back after a short break. দর্শক, আমরা ছোট্ট বিজ্ঞাপন বিরতির পর ফিরে আসছি। শবনম চৌধুরীর সাথে কথা বলবো। আপনারা যোগ দিতে পারেন আমাদের সঙ্গে ফেসবুক লাইভে অথবা সরাসরি প্রশ্নের মাধ্যমে। শুভ সন্ধ্যা যারা এইমাত্র আমাদের সঙ্গে যোগ দিলেন, আমাদের সঙ্গে রয়েছেন শবনম চৌধুরী, ফর্মার ডিটেকটিভ সুপারিনটেন্ডেন্ট, মেট্রোপলিটন পুলিশ। আমরা কথা বলছি পুলিশের সঙ্গে আমাদের জনগণের সম্পর্ক নিয়ে, এবং বিজ্ঞাপন বিরতিতে যাবার আগে আমার প্রশ্ন ছিল শবনমের কাছে যে স্টপ অ্যান্ড সার্চ এই ইস্যুতে তিনি কি মনে করছেন। So what's your take on stop and search?
I have a very big opinion on stop and search. First of all, the first thing I would say, I absolutely advocate stop and search. It's a very important and powerful tactic for police officers to use. However, what I would say is this. Young black males are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than your counter white males and females, for example. And the police officers will quite right in saying that the vast majority of victims and perpetrators of knife crime and violent crime are from the black community. However, that does not mean to say that every black member of the community should then be subjected to stop and search. And I think here are where some of the issues lie. So I believe, as do many people within policing and certainly former police officers, and people from the black community, that young black males in particular are then subjected to being racially profiled. So what will happen is, as police officers, they don't necessarily have to be racist to profile somebody, but what they will do is they'll put, instead of having grounds to stop somebody, they'll see a young black male in an area which is a crime hotspot for whether it's drugs, violence, knife crime, and they will approach that young man generally and then subject them to stop and search, and they will use the grounds, the rationale that they will say, well, I can smell cannabis, or you're in an area where, or you look like somebody that committed a burglary or robbery, or
you're just driving a posh car, and how do you
people get profiled because they happen to be driving through an area where they're driving a nice Mercedes with tinted windows, and then they're subjected to stop and search. What is really, really important is people don't mind being stopped and searched. What they want to know is that the grounds and the rationale that are provided to them are ethical, and that they are professional, and that the officers are not disproportionately stopping people because of the fact that it's purely based on the colour of their skin. Use of handcuffs, you know, you don't just go up to somebody and say, I'm going to handcuff you. You've got to provide a rationale, and you've got to justify why you handcuff somebody.
Okay, we hear the reason, the rationale that you have explained, but the data that you have, that black and Asian youth or men are disproportionately stopped under this stop and search process or this rule. So what has police done about it?
So since the last few, you saw what happened with Bianca Williams, the athlete who was subjected to stop and search, and the baby was taken outside of the car. What's been happening, as I understand it from across policing, well, the Mayor has introduced a new engagement plan with local communities, working with statutory partners, but also working with charities, working closely with black members of the community. So there'll be lots of groups that go on within policing, where young people who are subjected to stop and search will come in, and they'll help train officers so that officers know how to speak to people, how to engage with them, how to have a conversation with them before they actually even get round to the stop and search. So there's a lot of work that goes on around that. However, they have a long, long way to go, because I do believe that this is one of the biggest issues within policing that has eroded trust and confidence amongst the underrepresented groups.
Absolutely, and absolutely. In terms of keeping and moving on to, we should have someone from the community, Masood Ahmed, who is a social worker. So we will try and connect him. He has been doing a lot of work in the community with gang violence, youth violence, which is another area that we would like to discuss in this show. In terms of that, gives a lot of concern, especially for the Bangladeshi community and for the Asian community and black community, where young people are getting into gang fights, young people are getting into drugs, you know, being a drug mule and things like that, where parents feel very, very helpless. And we often see that police is actually, that's the view of the community, that they're not doing much to actually kind of use intelligence or use to divert, to bring the kind of to bring measures where young people can be diverted, or using intelligence so people can be supported before they get into all this, or get, arrest the people who are involved with county line and those kind of big drug dealings. So confidence on the police, especially from the ethnic minority community, in dealing with youth violence seems to be very, very poor or very, very low.
Yeah, so I would have to be honest and say, Urmee, I don't completely agree with you on those points. I led a gangs unit across East London, across Hackney and across Barking, Dagenham and Havering. And what I would say is this, is every borough have units that deal with gangs officers who are trained to work with the local communities, but you also have schools officers, safer schools officers, who work within the schools, who work with students, who work with pupils, who ensure that when they're leaving school that they are making sure that they're not being...
But how many schools have got police officers? It's hardly any, because of their cut, because of the resources, hardly any police officers.
No, every school, what happens is that you've got primary and then you've got secondary and then you've got colleges, and they carry out risk assessments, and they'll look at assessments of which areas are predominantly having issues around gangs or violence or knife crime in and around the schools areas. Every school has a police contact. Now, not every police officer will go into those schools because, quite rightly, as you say, there have been cuts made. So they've reduced the numbers of schools officers. But what they'll do is one schools officer may be responsible for 3 or 4 schools, and that they will work closely with the teachers, with the students and with the pupils, and they will work with the neighbourhood officers who will then go into the schools and work with them. There's a couple of things I'd say to you, because you talked about parents being concerned. Young people get groomed as young as 9 into gangs, and what will happen is they will get approached outside of the schools generally, or young people get groomed online, because when you come from an area where it's poverty and there's deprived communities, and you go to school and you see other kids with expensive trainers, mobile phones and new designer jackets and so on, you want to be part and parcel of all of that. And this is where young kids get groomed. So if children are going home to their families and suddenly they've got a pair of trainers, Nike trainers that are worth £120, and parents are saying, where on earth did you get that from? And the child is saying, I won it in a school raffle. It's unlikely that that did happen. What is more likely to have happened is that they're likely to have been groomed to be targeted by individuals to carry, exactly as you say, as mules, drugs across to different parts of London, and then they get rewarded by being given expensive items.
But in terms of because by the time, obviously parents do have a very big role, community do have a very big role, but at the same time, as you said, these people are so intelligent, these people invested so much into grooming young people. It's often the case that by the time the parents understand, by the time the parents come to know that actually my son is involved or my daughter is involved with either county lines or drug dealings or so on and so forth, it's often too late.
Well, I'm going to challenge on that, because I'm afraid my personal view is education starts from home, and parents need to know where their children are. Remember, there are single parent families out there. There are parents who struggle because they have to go to work and they're not able to be at home when their 12 or 13-year-old child comes home from school, and it's very, very difficult. However, there has to be a two-way process here, and that means that police have a responsibility, partners have a responsibility, but equally parents have a huge responsibility to know where their children are going, to make sure that they educate them not to carry knives and so on. Kids take knives from home and they hide them outside in the bushes, in the streets and so on. Some kids go missing for 2 or 3 days on end, and parents don't necessarily know, obviously they report them missing and so on, but all of that education starts at home. And I'm not saying that police are not responsible for it, but equally it's police, partners and family home education.
But do you believe that police, when a child is reported missing by the parents, not for the first time, but the second time or the third time or 5th time, 10 times, Do police actually take it seriously in terms of identifying that child?
Yes, they do. You get children that do exactly that. They go missing from homes, they go missing from care homes, they go missing from their own homes. And every child up to a certain age is classed as a different risk. And if you are a child that's 16 or under, or 17 or under, you'll be classed as high risk. And what will happen is every borough will have missing persons units, and they are responsible for looking to see where those, so they'll do hospital checks, they'll go back to the care homes, they'll contact the schools, they'll contact the friends and so on, they'll go onto their laptops, they'll do everything they can to try and relocate those children back with their family. But as I was saying, care homes, social services, families also have a responsibility to make sure that they work, because every time a child goes missing, automatically that missing person is reported to the police. Even if they go missing from a care home, when a child is put into care and they live in East London and then they're put into care in Colchester, it's inevitable that what they're going to do is they're going to run away from that care home and they're going to come back to the area that they live and grew up in. And these are the challenges that policing has in terms of working with partners to make sure that those children are well cared for once they're left, once they're out of their home environment. But equally, parents have the responsibility to know where their children are, what they're doing, who they're mixing with, who they are actually interacting with, which isn't always easy, as I've explained to you, when you've got single-parent families.
Absolutely. We'll wait for Masood to join so that we can go a little bit deeper into this youth violence issue. Let me take you back in terms of, obviously, you're a member of a BAME community. What was your journey in the police?
Very challenging. It was an amazing journey, but it was a roller coaster ride. I was subjected to discrimination in the early stages of my career, throughout my career. When I went for promotion, before that I was very well respected. People were very happy with my work, and then when I decided to go for promotion, which is very common for people of colour, is what will happen is when they start to climb the ranks, then there will be those who have racist or biased views that will try and prevent you from going further up into the ranks. I stood up and I challenged it in the very early stages of my career. That did blight my career for my journey, but equally I finished as a superintendent, detective superintendent, the highest ranking Muslim officer female to get to as detective status in the UK. Whilst I'm proud of that, equally it shouldn't be like that. There should be more women of colour at those particular ranks, but in those specialist fields and those, the investigative world. But what it did for me was all the negatives that happened with me, I turned them into positives. So I made sure that I supported black and Asian officers. I ran huge events to ensure that there was more flexible working across the organisation. I ensured that there was more representation of male and female officers of colour within the criminal investigation and the specialist departments. I hosted an event in 2014 whilst I was in policing for 500 black and minority officers, because I wanted to do a thematic review of the challenges that were facing officers of colour. And some of those challenges were the same challenges that I faced in 1999, which is so utterly disappointing, because you want to make sure that policing does improve in many, many ways. And it has done, because there is more representation, but it still needs to happen, because you're never going to eradicate racism or sexism or misogyny completely, but you can work with people within the organisation and partners to try to reduce it as much as you can.
So what's your employment strategy? I mean, how does that reflect, or how does that attract people from the BAME community?
Well, the fact is, policing,
apart from we see the advert on the bus, back of the bus, that please join police, and you put a face of an Asian lady saying police is for you and blah blah blah. But
it is, yeah. So look, whilst my journey was very, very challenging, I would absolutely encourage people from black and minority. It's not going to be, if you think you're going to get into policing and it's going to be non-racist, non-sexist, non-misogynistic, then perhaps policing isn't for you. But equally, that will happen in any profession. The fact is, you need people of colour to be representative of the communities that they serve. It's really important that women, men of colour, of different backgrounds, are policing the community so that people like yourself can actually feel that, well, actually, there must be something good about policing because they are more representative of the service. It is a difficult challenge, but the fact is, the most important thing is that you have the courage to actually stand up and challenge those individuals that do try to that are biased, that are racist, or that make inappropriate comments, or that behave in a certain way. And that is one of the turning points right now for policing, post Sarah Everard, because of what's coming out of policing now, particularly around the way women are treated within the organisation. It's all very well having females at the highest levels, but you've got to have safe spaces for people to be able to speak openly and challenge and say, look, this officer is behaving in a certain way,
Absolutely.
race or gender-wise, and now I want you to help me and support me. And these are now the areas of policing that they are starting to make some changes.
Thank you. We have Masood Ahmed with us. Masood Ahmed is a social worker by profession. At the moment, he's running lots of training and mentoring for Bangladeshi community and very much involved with helping young people who are involved with gang crimes and county lines. Masood bhai, welcome to the show. We have got Shabnam Chaudhri, former Detective Superintendent, Metropolitan Police. And so I would like you to put some question to Sarah, to Shabnam, in terms of your experience of dealing with youth violence, gang crime, and how do we bring the faith and the trust back on the police, especially from the BAME community, because that has been a very talked issue at the moment in terms of, from Sarah to Sabina. Where do we stand in terms of our relationship with the police? Masood bhai, your question.
Yes, good evening and assalamu alaikum. Really nice to see you, Urmee, after a long time, and also Shabnam Chaudhri. Really nice to see you, and I've been listening to some of the very...
I think it will be really helpful to have your sound up a bit, because we are having difficulties hearing your voice.
Okay, I think your studio will have to do something.
No, that's fine. That's fine. We can now hear you.
Okay, that's better. This is a makeshift arrangement because I'm just joining this program to see if we can do something about some of these problems that all of us are facing as a society, especially in light of the recent sad attack on a member of parliament, Sir Amos. We all respected him, and he is an outstanding member of the community. And the Muslim community in particular, I think, have appreciated many of his involvements. So I think the challenge for us really is, how do we work in a way that gets our young people on board and they feel that they matter and they feel listened to, they feel that their views count. Because there is this increasing trend where you see the older generation or the grown-ups are moving in one direction and the young people are going in complete different or opposing direction. I don't want to generalize, but obviously we're talking about that community or that section of our community amongst the youth who are feeling marginalized, who are getting involved in crimes. And I just wonder whether the police sometimes just knowingly turn a blind eye to gang problem, to violent crimes, and drug dealing, which is at the root of many of the problems. I would like to know from yourself, Shabnam Chaudhri, what you think, as someone who was an insider in the police force, what you think really is at the root of the problem?
Well, there was a lot of questions in there and lots of concerns. I think the first thing to sort of respond to, particularly with the tragic loss of Sir David Amos, but the one thing that he is actually asking for was a youth parliament, as I understand it. So I think that's a great start for young people to get on board, particularly ensuring that if they and when they do initiate a youth parliament, that they have good representation from all sections of the community. The other point that you raised about police not taking notice or not being particularly interested in gang violence and the violence against young men and drugs and so on, I think you'll find, and I worked in Hackney, I led on the gangs units there, and I led a 6-month operation which was covert and then was overt, and I worked very hard with the teams there. Well, they worked incredibly hard. Every borough across London do have gangs teams, units, who work with local partners. So they'll work with probation, they'll work with education, and they'll work with housing, and they'll work with young people to divert them away from gangs and drugs. The issues are that young people have obviously got to want to engage with police. So it's when young people, when police know that these young people are perhaps involved in criminality or heading in a certain direction, then what they will do is they'll try to work with young people to try and redirect them. So you have cadets, for example, you have safer schools officers, you have gangs units, you have the local CID teams who will maybe get involved with arresting people or being involved with victims and witnesses, who try to educate them. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but the most important thing here that I would say is also about collaboration. So it's not just something that comes from the police, it comes from communities as well. So I'm not sure what work you exactly do, but you must be working with young people to get them on board, to work with local police units. Do you get involved with police and so on?
Yes,
we'll come back. I'm sure Masood Bhai has lots of other questions, but Masood Bhai, we will keep the questions in relation to especially gang violence within black community, black and Asian community, and how do we get the confidence back of the community on the police. So we will continue our discussion. ছোট্ট বিজ্ঞাপন বিরতির পর দর্শক ফিরে আসছি, আপনারা সরাসরি যুক্ত হতে পারেন আমাদের সঙ্গে প্রশ্নের মাধ্যমে। ফিরে আসছি ঝটপট। দর্শক আমরা ফিরে এসেছি আজকের আলাপচারিতার শেষ অংশে আমরা কথা বলছি Shabnam Chaudhri, former detective superintendent Metropolitan Police, and we also have Masood Ahmed, who is a consultant social worker and has got extensive experience of working with youth involved in gang violence and county lines and things like that. So Masood bhai আপনাকেও স্বাগতম আমাদের স্টুডিওতে আমাদের সঙ্গে থাকবার জন্য। আমরা কথা বলছি Shabnam Chaudhriর সাথে, বাট আমরা তার কাছে জানতে চাইবো যে এবারে একটু আমরা যেহেতু সময় খুব অল্প, সময় গড়িয়ে যাচ্ছে, আমরা জানতে চাইবো যে আমাদের কনফিডেন্স অ্যাবাউট স্পেশালি ফিমেল from the Asian community, female and involved in domestic violence, what sort of confidence do we actually have on the police from the victim to report and getting justice, getting a service from the police?
Well, there is underreporting of domestic abuse of particularly females, and particularly from the Asian communities. And I worked across Newham and East London over the years with those sections of the community, and it's a whole host of reasons why those sorts of crimes are not reported, partly because of the lack of trust and confidence, partly because of the fact that women in those sections of the community fear reprisals from family members, from the extended family members, and also from family members abroad. So because within the Asian community people want to keep things in-house and they like to resolve issues themselves, and that's not always the case when a woman has been beaten or abused in many ways. So these are some of the reasons that they don't know. And also when you get women that come from Pakistan, India, different parts of other countries where they're here and English isn't necessarily their first language, they don't necessarily understand the laws. So there's lots of work that goes on with partners and with policing to try and ensure that women do come forward to report domestic abuse, and it's really, really important. It takes a huge amount of courage for victims to come forward and report such abuse.
Masood bhai, আপনার কাছে জানতে চাইবো যে do you think that police, especially in these areas where there's a high volume or high number of Asian and black communities living, that they are doing enough to restore or to gain the trust of these, specifically these communities, or what is it that we expect from the community, from the police, especially in relation to domestic violence, reporting domestic violence?
Very important question. Yeah, domestic violence, and also what we're witnessing now, there is increasing incidents of gang activities, gang rape, and all sorts of unpleasant things going on. And what we need is a two-pronged approach. From the community leaders, community activists, professionals, and particularly within the faith community, I think there is a need for faith leaders to realize that this is a growing problem and we need a wholesome approach, all-direction approach to try and address this. First of all, this idea that we need to keep it all hush-hush and manage it in-house quietly, this is not working because the victims are feeling more and more marginalized, and they need to be protected, they need to be safeguarded. That's the first thing.
But
secondly,
Masood bhai, do we feel that the police have got enough commitment, enough means or enough right kind of attitude for them to be able to work in partnership with whether it's faith group or whether it's community leaders? Because obviously we have got Shabnam, so I want to put Shabnam in a position to say yes, this is happening, or not, this is not happening, and what else the police can actually do to regain the confidence of the community.
I think the biggest challenge for the police is to have a force across the country, not just in inner cities, but across the country, where the police force reflect a good section, of the diversity that exists within the community. And unfortunately, we know that the facts speak for themselves. The evidence on the ground is that the police force do not reflect.
Absolutely. I mean, we had that question
too. In terms of faith and in terms of understanding of cultures. So there is a lot of jumping to conclusions. So I don't know what more the police need to do, but certainly in my work with young people, with families, with victims, and as a consultant, and also, I do a lot of motivational public speaking, and I spoke at a violent crime summit not that long ago, where there were police as well as community leaders and politicians involved. What I highlight is the fact that we all need to work together, but at the end of the day, not turn a blind eye to certain types of crimes and then get all excited about certain things in a disproportionate way. So
okay, but Mazher bhai, let me stop you there. Let me put the question to Shabnam, because obviously, as you said, we all need to work together, but from a community perspective, I'm sure my viewers would like to put that question to Shabnam, that we have been hearing this, and from our community leaders as well, that we have to work together, but these are all words. What we have seen since the death of murder of Stephen Lawrence, police have said, you're doing internal audits, you're doing internal investigations, this and that, but 2021, we are seeing still a police force who is very much detached from the public. We are still talking about restoring faith and confidence on the police. So what has actually changed? We know very much that we need to work together, but where exactly is the commitment, Shabnam?
Well, I think the commitment is there. I think the issues points that you raise are that the trust and confidence is at the lowest that I can ever remember it. And I think that what's happened in the last 7 months in terms of Sarah Everard, Sabina Nessa, last year's Black Lives Matters, all these have eroded trust and confidence much, much further. And I think what it has done is ignited a movement amongst women and young girls to actually come out and speak out and say, we're not having this anymore, enough is enough. Now, I know that policing have given a commitment. Remember, I'm not in policing anymore, but I do believe that they have got a mountain to climb. And the commitment is there from many, many officers. You've heard from the National Police Chiefs Council, Martin Hewitt, who's taken it seriously. Now they've just appointed a national lead for violence against women and girls, a Deputy Chief Constable, Maggie Blythe, and I believe that that is one huge step towards ensuring that violence against women and girls is taken more seriously. What I think does need to happen is the strategy was published in July of this year, but that strategy, it's all very well implementing that strategy. What they need to do is elevate it and give it the importance it needs, such as they do for counter-terrorism. And the reason I think they need to do that is because once they give it that level of importance, what will happen is it will get more resources thrown at it. It will get more officers deployed into specialist units. It will allow policing to train more officers for violence against women and girls. That in itself will ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice, that we need to work with the criminal justice systems, because women are not being, they're coming forward. 30 allegations, 30 times a woman can be assaulted before she finally comes and makes that allegation. And you've just got to know that when that person is brought to trial, that justice is served, and that he is served a sentence, or that the appropriate action reflects the crime that was inflicted on her. And I'm talking about women and girls because men are also subjected to violence, but predominantly in the main it is females.
Mazher bhai, so you are suggesting lots of few areas that from the community that we can support the police, because obviously I'm sure we all believe and we all know that police on their own will not be able to solve any crime or any issues that is so chronic in the community. From the community perspective, especially after Sarah Everard's situation, where we have actually seen it's the police who, a serving police officer who became the murderer, but what we also knew that afterwards that particular police officer had lots of previous concerns, which was either ignored or the vetting or the employment of that particular police officer was not done in the proper way. And Shabnam has also shared with us that how employment still within the police service doesn't always reflect the community. So there are lots of challenges, but literally in very few words, Masood Bhai, if you could put your views across that in terms of from the community perspective, what is it that we could support the local police with?
I think the community is willing if the community is being engaged. Many initiatives are taken, but what you need to do is that when people give you feedback, when the community speaks and says, we want this change, we want that change, that needs to be taken seriously. And that's where the problem is. I was involved, some of you will remember, Urmee, back in 2017 when we had a tragic death in my land of a young man, 18-year-old, Syed Jamanur Islam. I launched a campaign called StopKnifeCrime.uk, and we managed to mobilize the whole community. Over 10,000 people were involved in his funeral. Now, so the community in one single voice at that time said, we don't mind you doing stop and search. Do it and follow through. If you find criminals carrying knives or doing criminal activities, deal with them. That's not a problem. But do it equitably, like Shabnam Chaudhri has said earlier. The concern is about disproportionate picking and choosing and emphasizing certain crime and not being wholesome and being consistent. And that's where the challenge is. So engage the community, listen to all the different sections of the community, but make sure that you follow through. Initiatives are introduced and then not follow through. That's where the biggest challenge is.
Yeah, Shabnam, obviously, as I put that challenge to you, that the data is clearly showing the disproportionality of Black and Asian youth and men being stopped across London by the stop and search. And that makes young people, Black and Asian young people who are not into criminality, very, very anti-police.
It does make them anti-police, and I think these are the areas of policing that needs to be properly looked into. And I think that the point Masood Bhai was making was about, listening to the community. Look, Cressida Dick has announced that there will be a review of policing. She has appointed an independent person to work alongside her. They're looking at vetting, they'll be looking at training, they'll be looking at the professional standards of their officers, they're looking at behaviours which will include sexism, which will include racism. I'm not overly confident that, I'm hoping that it will be an honest and open review, but although you've got an independent person coming in, it still doesn't have complete independency. However, Home Secretary Priti Patel has announced the following day that there will be a public inquiry, but this will be focused around Wayne Couzens, who murdered brutally Sarah Everard, and what went wrong with him, how he was allowed to get away with what he did, how he behaved before he was subjected to being arrested, and what the vetting process is, because there were mistakes made, as I understand it, in relation to his vetting. Vetting needs an overhaul within policing. They do have systems and processes in place, but they don't necessarily adhere to them. So I think there will be some changes that get made in the next 6 months or the next year or so. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think the most important thing for me, for what you were talking about earlier on, is about collaboration with communities. And I'm not talking about the partners, I'm talking about key members of the community, people like Masood, who has already working with community members, but those people that have been involved in crime, that have lived and breathed it, that can come and speak to young people, educate them, re-divert them, and that, we've lost youth clubs where young people could go to, all those sorts of things that are not happening anymore, which has a huge impact on them, because you don't want kids sitting at home becoming lone wolves or terrorists or groomed in certain ways because they're doing it behind a computer screen, or that they're being groomed outside of the schools and so on.
But in terms of obviously resources, because we keep on hearing that police is also saying resources at a stretch where there's hardly you have any capacity to do any preventative work or intelligence gathering work to actually prevent a crime or to support communities who are very, very vulnerable generally. and would need additional support. So where do you stand? I mean, how you're going to get more resources? You know, what commitment is there from the government?
Well, look, cuts were made in 2010. 20,000 officers were cut back from policing. What I would say is this: we cannot use the excuse forever that we don't have police resources, because the fact is we've still got to police, not me, but they've got to police communities. In the process of making cutbacks amongst policing, what they did do is they work smarter. So every officer has a laptop, every officer has iPads, so that when they're out and about on the streets, instead of having to report and investigate a crime to begin with, they then don't have to come back to the police station to type it all up on their system. Body-worn camera. That has reduced the number of complaints around stop and search, for example. Officers should be switching their cameras on immediately so that there's that trust there, and that, you know, that they're doing their job professionally and ethically and proportionately. So there's, you know, they've got more vehicles and cars out on the streets. They've got less police stations, but they use that money to start increasing the resourcing across policing. My personal view is one of the best ways to engage with the public is to bring back more neighbourhood policing. Now, I hope that that is something that will be considered within policing. Again, as I say, that maybe their resourcing capabilities, but that is one way to ensure that everything that policing is done within the heart of the community, so that local communities know who their beat officer is, who their local safer neighbourhoods officer is, who they can go to pass intelligence to, whether it be for drug dealing, antisocial behaviour, or to the extreme of counter-terrorism.
So in terms of, obviously, what would be your comments to Sabina's parents in terms of ensuring that streets of London would be, or streets of UK would be safe for women?
Well, I would say it to any woman. I think the first thing is that we've got to stop putting the onus on women to say that it's up to you to protect yourself. The onus should be on men, the education of men from a very young age. The fact that men and boys, when they're out in the public domain or when they're within their own home environments, treat women with respect and with dignity. And if they see a woman who is perhaps having, you know, being harassed in the street, instead of laughing along with it with their mates, that they put a stop to it, that they start educating their friends. So the onus mustn't be on women. Of course we need to take precautions, of course we should always be cautious. I'm always very cautious when I go out, but that doesn't mean to say that I've got to take responsibility for every element of self-protection when I'm out and about, because actually it's not me that's the problem, it's the male perpetrator out there that is the problem, the one that harasses somebody, that stalks somebody, that abuses a female, that makes derogatory comments because of the way that she chooses to dress, and that choice of being, or the way she wants to dress, shouldn't be taken away from her because she feels uncomfortable, because she knows that a young boy or a man is going to be, you know, behave in a certain way towards her.
Masud Bhai, I want to briefly come to you in terms of, Shabnam was also saying that, and we know in terms of data, that hate crime, especially towards Muslim women and from BAME community, that there has been an increase. And at the same time, I'm not sure whether we are seeing that level of increased reporting to the police. So how do we actually support, especially women from Muslim culture, who are either wearing hijab or a jilbab on the street and being faced with racially motivated hate comments? So, I mean, what would be your question to Shabnam in terms of bringing, again, the confidence back on the police from specifically this particular community?
Yeah, so this is a very important question on me, and I think my question to Shabnam would be, what advice do you have regarding this increasing incidence of Islamophobia, and where, you know, certain communities within, or certain community organizations, for example, the Muslim Council of Britain, has been campaigning long and hard to try and make Islamophobia definition accepted across the board, but it remains a debated issue for deliberate reasons, that people do not want to identify this as a problem. So women, I mean, especially after this most recent incident, MCB have issued, an organization I have involvement with, guidance to community organizations and members of particularly the Somali community, regarding the potential for them to become victims. Now, the police...
Mazher, I'm really sorry to stop you because I literally have 1 minute, so I want to come back to Shabnam for her response.
So I say two things. First of all, never ever feel that you can't wear your hijab or your niqab or dress the way that you want to, that reflects your culture or your community or the way that you feel that you want to dress. And the other thing I would say is that the really, really important issue here is ensuring that you do report it. I'm not saying that it will be thoroughly investigated, because if there's no perpetrators that you can target at that particular time, what is really important is that victims do actually report it, so that they can build up a picture, they can build up an area that might be more subjected to that sort of hate crime.
Thank you, Shabnam Chaudhri, former Detective Superintendent with Police. Thank you for your time. দর্শক, আগামী সোমবারের আলাপচারিতা দেখবার আমন্ত্রণ রইল। বিদায় নিচ্ছি আজকের মতন। শুভরাত্রি।